My brother stood at a podium in front of 600 people, holding an award with his own name engraved on it, and told the crowd that everything he'd built entirely alone. The exact same week he'd looked me in the eye at our mother's hospital bedside and called me a failure for choosing to stay by her side instead of chasing a career of my own. I was sitting 11 rows back that night, in a rented dress I almost didn't wear, watching him accept the Beacon Award for Entrepreneurial Excellence, watching 400 strangers applaud a version of his success story that had never once included my name, even though I was the reason half of what he was standing up there describing had ever existed at all. I didn't stand up. I didn't say a word. I sat there in silence while he thanked investors, thanked his team, thanked a business school professor from 15 years earlier, and never once mentioned the sister who had spent 6 years building the actual foundation his entire company stood on. What my brother didn't know that night, sitting comfortably behind that podium under the stage lights, was that the award committee's keynote historian had spent the past 3 weeks quietly interviewing former employees, early investors, and one specific archived business partner for a retrospective segment about the company's founding years, a segment that was about to air on the same screen behind him, in front of the exact same 600 people, less than 4 minutes after he sat back
down.
Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just embarrass my brother in front of a room full of people who admired him. It rewrote, in real time, the entire story of who actually built the career everyone in that room had come to celebrate. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you need to go back 9 years, to the summer everything in our family quietly split in two. I'm Naomi Ferris. My brother, Julian, is 3 years older than me. We grew up in a modest split-level house outside Columbus, raised by our mother, Diane, after our father left when I was 11. Julian was always the bright one, the one adults singled out at family gatherings, the one our mother introduced with visible pride even when he was just a teenager with a half-finished business idea and a garage full of second-hand computer parts. I loved him. I still do, in the complicated way you love someone who spent years quietly convincing an entire family you were less than you actually were. Julian started his company, Verdant Systems, a sustainable packaging startup, when he was 26 and I was 23. He had the vision, I'll give him that honestly. He understood, earlier than most people in the industry, that biodegradable packaging solutions were about to matter enormously to a market that hadn't fully caught up yet. What he didn't have, in those first 18 months, was capital, an operations background, or anyone willing to work 80-hour weeks for deferred pay while he chased investors. I had just finished a degree in supply chain management, unglamorous, but exactly the kind of practical skill set an early-stage manufacturing startup desperately needed and almost never budgeted for. Julian asked me to help temporarily, just until he found funding to hire a real operations lead. I said yes because he was my brother and because I believed the way you believe things about family before you've been taught not to, that helping him build something mattered more than my own 5-year plan. I spent the next 3 years essentially running Verdant Systems' entire production and logistics operation without an official title, without equity, and, for the first 14 months, without any pay at all beyond what Julian described as founder shares that never materialized into an actual signed agreement. I negotiated our first supplier contracts. I solved a packaging failure rate that had been quietly bankrupting the company before I ever touched the process. I personally drove product to our first 3 retail partners when our contracted freight company fell through 2 days before a launch deadline because Julian was in California pitching investors and there was, quite literally, no one else. None of that ever appeared in any interview Julian gave. Not one. It got harder, not easier, once our mother's health started declining. Diane was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's the same year Verdant Systems finally closed its series of funding round. The round I had spent 4 months preparing the entire financial and operations due diligence package for, working nights and weekends around my actual job because Julian's team was too small and too green to produce anything investors would trust on their own. I made a decision that summer that quietly reshaped the next 6 years of my life. I stepped back from full-time work at Verdant Systems to become our mother's primary caregiver, taking a lighter, part-time advisory role with the company so I could manage her medications, her physical therapy schedule, her doctor's appointments, and eventually, as her condition progressed, Nearly everything else a body slowly stops being able to do on its own. Julian, by then relocated to San Francisco full-time, running a company that had grown to 60 employees, visited perhaps 4 times a year. Every visit followed the same pattern. He'd arrive with an expensive gift, spend an afternoon reminiscing with our mother while she was having a good day, and leave within 48 hours citing an investor call or a board meeting he couldn't reschedule. He rarely called between visits. When he did, the conversation was almost always about something he needed: a signature on a document, an update on a supplier relationship I still quietly maintained from my advisory seat, once even a request that I smooth things over with a former colleague he'd let go badly and who was threatening to go public about it. I never argued with him about any of it directly. I told myself, the way I'd always told myself, that keeping the peace mattered more than being right, and that our mother, watching her children fight, was the last thing either of us should ever put her through. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't fully understand for another 5 years, was that Julian had spent those same years quietly constructing an entirely different narrative about our shared history, one he told consistently enough, to enough people, that it eventually hardened into accepted fact within his professional circles. In interviews, in investor pitch decks, in a widely shared founder profile published by a major business outlet, Julian described Verdant Systems as something he had built essentially alone in its critical early years, a scrappy solo founder story, the kind investors and journalists love, the kind that photographs well on a magazine cover. My name appeared nowhere in any of it. Not once, across 6 years of press coverage. I found out how thoroughly that story had taken hold roughly 8 months before our mother passed, when a former Verdant Systems investor, a soft-spoken venture partner named Charlotte DeShields, who had worked directly with me during the Series A diligence process, reached out to reconnect and mentioned, almost in passing, how remarkable it was that Julian had built the company's entire early operations infrastructure himself before hiring his current ops team. I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. I didn't correct her. I told myself it didn't matter, that the people who actually knew the truth, Julian, and by extension our mother, were the only people whose knowledge I actually needed. I was wrong about that, though not in the way I expected. Our mother's decline accelerated sharply in her final year. I moved back into her house full-time, arranging my life entirely around a schedule dictated by medication windows, physical therapy sessions, and the increasingly frequent nights she needed help simply getting to the bathroom and back. Julian visited twice that year. During the second visit, 3 weeks before she passed, we had the conversation that would define everything that came afterward. We were standing in the kitchen while our mother napped upstairs. Julian had just closed a major new funding round for Verdant Systems' international expansion, and he was understandably energized by it, the kind of expansive, talkative energy that used to remind me of the boy who built things out of spare parts in our garage. He asked, almost offhandedly, what I was planning to do once things settled down, and something in his tone, the careless assumption that caregiving was a temporary interruption rather than the entire shape my life had taken, made me finally say something I'd swallowed for years. I gave up my career for this family, Julian. I gave up mine, so you could build yours. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said the sentence I would replay for the rest of my life. Naomi, you didn't give up a career. You never really had one to give up. You picked the easy path, staying home, taking care of things that didn't require any real risk. I built something out of nothing while you were content watching from the sidelines. That's not the same as sacrifice. That's just what happens to people who never really wanted to compete in the first place. I didn't cry in front of him. I went upstairs, sat outside our mother's bedroom door, and let it land fully in private, the way I'd learned to process almost everything painful in my life by then. Our mother passed away 11 days later. I was the one holding her hand. I share all of that not because I need sympathy for it now, but because it's the context that makes what happened at the Beacon Awards ceremony, for months after her funeral, land the way it landed. Julian had been nominated for the award months earlier, part of an annual industry ceremony recognizing entrepreneurs who'd built significant companies from early-stage startups into established market players. The ceremony's organizers, as part of their tradition, produced a short video retrospective for every major award recipient, typically a warm, celebratory piece stitched together from old photos and a few flattering soundbites from early colleagues. For Julian's segment, the ceremony's keynote historian, a meticulous documentary producer named Priya Anand, had spent 3 weeks reaching out to Verdant Systems' early stakeholders for interview material, standard practice for a retrospective of this scale. She reached out to me almost as an afterthought, having found my name buried in an old supplier contract from the company's second year, one of the only surviving documents where my role had actually been recorded in writing. She had no idea, when she called, that I was Julian's sister. She simply wanted a quote about the early operations challenges the company had overcome. I told her everything. Not out of anger. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about my own motives a great deal since, but because for the first time in 9 years, someone was asking me a direct question about my own history, and I was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with revenge, of continuing to erase myself to keep someone else comfortable. Priya listened. Then she asked if I had any documentation, contracts, emails, anything that could corroborate what I was describing.
I did.
I'd kept everything, the way people who've been quietly written out of their own story sometimes instinctively do, without fully admitting to themselves why they're keeping it. Supplier negotiation records with my name on every signature line. The original due diligence package I'd built for the Series A round, my name in the file metadata on every document. Emails from Charlotte DeShields, the investor, specifically praising my operations work during that same funding round. Priya spent 2 more weeks verifying all of it independently, cross-referencing with early employees and Charlotte herself, before she told me, with the careful professionalism of someone who understood exactly what she was about to do, that the retrospective segment for Julian's award would now be telling a more complete story than the ceremony's organizers had originally planned. I attended the ceremony because Priya asked me to, and because some part of me, after 9 years of silence, wanted to actually be present for whatever happened next rather than hearing about it secondhand. Julian took the stage to enthusiastic applause, accepted the Beacon Award for Entrepreneurial Excellence, and delivered a polished 7-minute speech thanking investors, his current executive team, and a business school professor from 15 years earlier who'd apparently once told him he had founder energy. He described, in vivid, well-rehearsed detail, the exhausting solo grind of Verdant Systems' earliest years, sleeping in the office, personally solving every operational crisis, building the company's foundation with nothing but his own determination. The audience ate it up.
Of course they did.
It's a wonderful story. It simply wasn't true. He sat back down to sustained applause. The lights dimmed for the retrospective video, the same format every honoree that evening had received, more music, archival photos. But this one opened differently. It opened with a photograph I hadn't seen in 6 years, me, 24 years old, standing in Verdant Systems' first cramped warehouse space, reviewing a shipping manifest with a supplier whose name I still remembered. Priya's narration, calm and measured, began describing the company's actual early operational history, the production failure rate I'd solved in the first year, the supplier contracts I'd personally negotiated, the freight crisis I'd resolved by driving product to retail partners myself when the company had no one else available. Then Charlotte DeShields appeared on screen, recorded specifically for the segment, describing in her own words how the operations and diligence work that secured Verdant Systems' critical series of funding had been built almost entirely by Naomi Ferris, Julian's sister, whose name I don't believe has ever actually appeared in any of the company's public materials, which is something I've always found strange, frankly, given how much of the early foundation was hers. The room went very quiet. The video closed on a final line of narration, delivered plainly, without dramatics, the way facts land hardest when they're not dressed up as anything more than what they are. Verdant Systems' celebrated founding story has long been told as one man's solo achievement. The documented record tells a more complete story, one built by 2 siblings, only one of whom has ever been publicly credited for it. The lights came back up. 600 people sat in a silence that had an entirely different texture than the applause 15 minutes earlier. I watched Julian's face from 11 rows back, watched the practiced composure that had carried him through 9 years of interviews and investor pitches falter in real time, in front of every person whose respect he had spent nearly a decade carefully cultivating. He didn't look for me in the crowd. I don't think he could bring himself to. The ceremony's host, visibly unprepared for the moment the video had just created, offered a brief, awkward transition to the next award category. Julian left before the closing remarks. I found out later, through Charlotte, that he'd sat in his car in the venue's parking garage for nearly 40 minutes before driving home. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters more than the drama of that night. I didn't orchestrate that video to humiliate my brother in public. I answered a journalist's honest questions honestly, for the first time in 9 years, because I was finally tired enough of my own erasure to stop protecting a story that had never once protected me. What happened on that stage wasn't revenge. It was simply what occurs when documentation finally catches up to 9 years of a carefully maintained fiction. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet, cascading consequence that I hadn't anticipated and, if I'm honest, took no particular pleasure in watching. The business outlet that had published Julian's original scrappy solo founder profile ran a follow-up piece within days, considerably less flattering, built substantially on Priya's verified retrospective material. 2 of Verdant Systems board members reached out to me directly, not for any legal reason, but simply to ask, with visible discomfort, whether the company's public narrative needed formal correction going forward. Charlotte DeShields, whose venture firm still held a board seat, was blunter about it in a call we had a week later. Investors don't actually care that much about who gets credit for a founding story, Naomi. What we care about is whether the story we were told was true. And it wasn't. That matters for very different reasons than sentiment. Julian called me 9 days after the ceremony. It was the first time he'd called simply to talk in longer than I could remember. He didn't open with an apology. He opened by asking why I hadn't warned him. Would you have wanted me to? I asked, so you could control the story one more time? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since we were kids, considerably smaller than the one he used at podiums, he said, I've been telling that story so long I think I actually started believing it myself. I didn't rush to reassure him. I'd spent 9 years doing that kind of quiet emotional labor on his behalf, softening things, keeping the peace, making myself smaller so the moment could stay comfortable for him. I wasn't willing to do it reflexively anymore, not even now. I know, I said. That's exactly the problem, Julian. You believed it enough to tell it to my face, at Mom's bedside, 3 weeks before she died. You told me I never really wanted to compete. I built half of what put you on that stage, and you looked me in the eye and called it the easy path. He didn't defend himself this time. That, more than anything he could have said, told me something had actually shifted. We didn't reconcile quickly, and I want to be honest that we're still not fully reconciled in the way people probably hope for at the end of a story like this. But 3 months after the ceremony, Julian issued a formal, public correction to Verdant Systems' founding history, not because a lawyer told him to, but because, he told me, he'd finally sat with what it meant that I'd spent 6 years disappearing from my own life, so his story could stay clean. The company's official history now credits me by name as co-founder of its early operations, with a retroactive equity settlement negotiated, at Charlotte's insistence, through Verdant Systems' board rather than through any conversation between Julian and me directly. I used a portion of that settlement to fund a caregiver support fellowship in our mother's name, providing paid respite care to family caregivers who'd otherwise have to choose, the way I once did, between someone else's health and their own future. I returned, finally, at 32, to the operations career I'd set aside 9 years earlier, not at Verdant Systems, but at a mid-sized manufacturing firm that hired me specifically for the depth of hands-on experience I'd built during the very years Julian had spent telling people I hadn't built anything at all. Julian and I speak now, occasionally carefully, the way 2 people speak when they're relearning a relationship from a foundation that finally has honesty in it instead of a story built to make one person comfortable. He sent me the Beacon Award itself last spring, the actual physical trophy, with a short note that said only, "This should have had 2 names on it from the beginning." I can't undo 9 years, but I can stop pretending they didn't happen. I keep it in a drawer, not displayed anywhere. I'm still deciding what it means to me. I suspect I'll be deciding that for a while yet. What I know for certain, standing on the other side of that ceremony now, is this. I never once needed a video, an award committee, or 600 strangers to know what I had built. I always knew. What I needed, and what I finally got, was for the truth to simply exist somewhere outside my own memory, documented, corroborated, undeniable, so that the years I'd spent quietly holding a family together would never again be something one person got to erase with a single sentence at a hospital bedside. If there's one thing this entire experience taught me, it's this. Quiet sacrifice doesn't disappear just because no one is applauding for it. It waits. And sometimes, when you least expect it, the truth finds its own stage. Thank you so much for staying with this story until the very end. If Naomi's journey from quiet caregiver to finally being seen moved you, let me know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. And if you want more stories about hidden sacrifice, long overdue recognition, and the truth that eventually finds its way into the light, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder that what you build quietly still counts, even when no one's watching. What would you have done in Naomi's position? Tell me below.